Have you ever faced a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill? In this video, we're diving into the story of Abraham and how God's promise, made when everything seemed lost, not only changed his life but the fate of an entire nation. The promise was simple: descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. But what's truly remarkable is how Abraham believed, even when reality seemed to say otherwise. If you've ever experienced moments when your faith was tested or felt discouraged waiting for something that never seems to come, this video is for you. We'll show how Abraham's journey can offer powerful lessons for your life, especially when it comes to perseverance and trust. Stay with us, because this story will teach you how to believe, even when everything seems impossible, and how that faith can transform your own path. God chose Abraham at an unexpected time, when he and his wife Sarah were already advanced in age, practically without hope of having children. It was a powerful yet challenging call. The promise was clear: Abraham would be the father of a great nation, with descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Imagine the impact of this promise on someone who had no children up to that point. It was a divine promise that defied natural laws and required absolute trust. Even when faced with the improbability, Abraham decided to trust. His heart, which could easily have been filled with doubts, chose faith. He accepted the call without question, even though logic said otherwise. It was a bold decision, especially for someone who had lived long enough to see how the world works. But when God calls, the only sensible response is obedience. Abraham knew this, and his trust began to pave the way for the fulfillment of the promise. God's promise was filled with significance. It wasn't just about Abraham having an heir, it was about the impact his faith would have on future generations. God was offering something greater than he could comprehend at that moment. The call wasn't limited to one single moment in Abraham's life, but spanned his entire journey. Every decision he made from that point on was an expression of faith, and that faith connected him directly to the promise of countless descendants. Abraham's trust in God's promise wasn't mere optimism, it was unwavering certainty, even when everything around him suggested it was impossible. He and Sarah were far from the ideal age to start a family, but God's promise transcended any human obstacle. That trust made Abraham an example of faith, a figure whose decisions would resonate for centuries. His faith became a beacon of hope for all who faced the impossible. Yet Abraham didn't know that his trust in God's promise was just the beginning of a long journey. After all, faith isn't a one-time event, but a path to be walked. The call he received was the first step, but the full fulfillment of the promise was still to come. And so, with a confident heart, he prepared to face the challenges ahead. One night, God took Abraham outside his tent and told him to look up at the sky. The scene was breathtaking, a vast sea of stars lighting up the darkness. And it was under this celestial spectacle that God made a promise that would change everything. "Count the stars if you can," God said. "So shall your offspring be." Those stars became a powerful symbol, something tangible for Abraham to look at whenever doubt crept in. It was a divine metaphor of hope and multiplication. Each star that glittered in the sky seemed to represent a piece of Abraham's future, a future that, until then, he couldn't even imagine. It was as if God was drawing before him the map of a promise that, though distant, was real. The starry sky became a reminder that God's promises are vast, bigger than any human difficulty, and even when everything around said otherwise, those stars were there to reinforce Abraham's faith. At his advanced age, Abraham could have easily questioned the reality of that promise. But every time he looked at the sky, God's words reignited his hope. The stars became a symbol not only of multiplication, but also of patience. After all, for the promise to be fulfilled, time, perseverance, and above all, faith would be needed. The stars were the visible sign that God was in control, even if Abraham couldn't yet see the result. This simple act of looking up at the sky changed how Abraham viewed his journey. Whenever doubts arose, he just had to look up and remember the promise. The metaphor of the stars was a constant reminder that faith isn't about what you can see now, but about trusting in what's yet to come. And so, each star in the sky represented not only Abraham's future descendants, but also the unshakable strength of the faith he carried. Abraham's journey was just beginning, and those stars would guide him through moments of uncertainty. His faith was being shaped with every step, and the stars were the visible symbol that, no matter how long the wait, God's promise would be fulfilled. But the road ahead still held challenges, and Abraham would need more than a starry sky to keep his trust alive. Abraham's journey wasn't easy, nor was it quick. The promise he received from God seemed distant, especially as the years went by without the much-anticipated heir. He and Sarah were aging, and the circumstances only reinforced the impossibility of it all. Yet, Abraham maintained his faith. He understood that God's promise wasn't tied to human timing, but to God's perfect timing, where faith and patience would become his greatest allies. Abraham had to trust in a way that few could. Every new day, every new night under the stars, he chose to believe that the promise was still alive. This waiting period was not just a test of faith, but also of patience. The journey wasn't just about reaching the destination, but about the process of shaping his trust in God. During those years of waiting, Abraham and Sarah had to learn to put their anxiety aside and focus on what truly mattered, the promise that God had made. While many would have given up, Abraham and Sarah persisted, and it's precisely that patience that made their faith an example for future generations. The metaphor of the stars wasn't just an image of multiplication, but also of resilience. Abraham's journey showed that even when everything seems impossible, faith can be the foundation that sustains each step. And this patience, this waiting, was a crucial part of the transformation happening within them. Each day of waiting was an opportunity for Abraham to strengthen his relationship with God, and while there were moments of doubt and fragility, he never stopped believing. His patience wasn't just a virtue, it was proof that, even when time seems like an obstacle, God's promise is in motion. Abraham understood that, to experience the miracle, he had to go through the process. The long wait for the fulfillment of God's promise shaped Abraham's faith in profound ways. He became an example that true faith doesn't waver over time, and that patience is the fertile ground where God's greatest promises blossom. But the greatest test was still to come, and Abraham would need all the faith and patience he had cultivated thus far. After years of waiting, God's promise was finally fulfilled with the birth of Isaac. That moment represented far more than a father's joy in having a son. It was the beginning of a promise that would change the course of human history. Abraham's son wouldn't just be an heir, but the beginning of a lineage that would give rise to nations. God, faithful to his word, had honored Abraham's patience and faith, and this was only the first step in a much larger journey. Isaac's arrival brought with it the certainty that God was fulfilling what he had promised. Abraham could see in his son's eyes the reflection of the stars God had shown him so many years before. Each of Isaac's laughs, every step he took, was a living reminder that God's promises don't fail, even if they take time. Now, Abraham held in his arms the symbol of faith realized, and Isaac would be the start of a lineage that would spread across the world. But God's promise didn't stop with Abraham and his son. Isaac would be the first of a generation that would transform the course of history. God had promised that Abraham would be the father of nations, and this promise would echo throughout the centuries. Tribes, kings, and peoples who would come from his lineage formed the foundation of a spiritual and cultural heritage that still reverberates today. Abraham wasn't just a patriarch. He was the cornerstone of a story that would continue to be written for generations. This multiplication of his descendants, symbolized by the stars, wasn't just numerical, but also spiritual. Abraham's faith influenced not only the people born from his lineage, but also all those who, throughout history, were inspired by his example of trust and obedience to God. Abraham became the model for how faith can change not only a life, but also entire nations. The impact of his journey of faith is still felt by millions to this day. Abraham's story reminds us that true faith transcends time and space. His legacy wasn't just biological descendants, but a spiritual heritage that continues to shape generations. The fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham was the starting point for something much bigger, something that lives on in everyone who, like him, chooses to trust in God, even when everything seems impossible. Now that you've learned about Abraham's incredible journey, the question is, how do you deal with promises that seem impossible in your life? Can you, like Abraham, maintain faith even when reality seems to move in a different direction? Abraham's story teaches us that faith and perseverance can lead to unimaginable results, and this applies to the challenges you face today. True transformation happens when you choose to trust, even without seeing immediate results. So, are you ready to apply these lessons to your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us how you've been facing your own journeys of faith. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning how great stories can bring lessons to our daily lives. Don't miss the next video, where we'll talk about an epic battle. Who would win, Samson or David?